Hi, we're Paloma Proudfoot, that's me, and Aniela. And together we've been collaborating in different permutations, I think for now 7 years. And we have our collaborative practice that's just us as a duo, which is our surnames, Proudfoot and Piasecka. And then as a wider group, Stasis with 2 other performers. And we all come from very different backgrounds. Aniela comes from more of a choreography background. I'm a sculptor in my solo work. And with Stasis, we work with an actress and another dancer, art performer. And we all met while we were studying together at Edinburgh, and some of us went to the art school and some of us went to the university. So we try and bring together all those different perspectives in our collaborative work. And a lot of our work in these different formations have been interacting with public spaces, but in different ways. So we've kind of split it into 3 categories for this talk. The first one being projects that draw from public spaces or are inspired by them, but are then shown in gallery spaces, so not in the public spaces themselves. The second group of projects are pieces that we've been invited to do that are other people's projects, but responding to a particular public space and are shown in those spaces. And then the third category, which is when our own self-initiated projects, drawing from public spaces and then being shown in them, that we have a more complete control of, I suppose. And the first project or piece that we're going to talk about is a piece that we made for Beaconsfield Gallery in Vauxhall. And it was an open call from Royal College of Art curating students. I was in the sculpture department at the time. And it is, ironically, in a railway arch that the gallery owns. And so it had to be in this space. That was the open call sort of brief. But we were really keen to, in the piece, talk about the rapidly regenerating area of Vauxhall around the gallery. And particularly, we were looking at New Covent Garden Flower Market, which it was new Covent Garden Market because it had moved from its original location in Covent Garden to Vauxhall, but then again to make way for more and more high-rise buildings. And even in its new location, it continues to be threatened to be moved further out of the city. And so we were looking at historically how in its old location in Covent Garden itself, there was this culture of the market, the pubs around the market that would serve both market traders and people who were ending their night out. And it had a weird sort of collision of nightlife and market trading culture. Those people like ending their nights and people starting their day, and there was a really like thriving culture around Covent Garden Market in this sort of nocturnal lifestyle. And we were looking at also the second New Covent Garden Market. On the off day, Sunday, when the market wasn't running, they'd have the Vauxhall Upmarket, which was like a huge array of market stalls that you could buy practically anything there. It was like very multicultural and like thriving market that was allowed to just pop up and exist in the sort of off time of the market. And then how it moving to its new location, and that it being further sanitized, and that not being allowed to happen anymore. So we were kind of looking at what was being discarded in the wider sense through this regeneration, what was being lost, but then also on a daily basis, visiting the flower market, we were struck by how much was being thrown away, and all the amazing flowers that were not quite perfect that were being thrown away in the bins every day. So for this performance, we gathered.
Get up really early in the morning.
Yeah, we get up really early in the morning to gather any flowers that were discarded from the bin in the bins at the market, sort of salvaging the flowers, getting kind of weird looks from the market traders, and using them to reinstall the installation in the gallery space every day. And then there were also choreographed sections of the piece, so it was combining sort of quite quiet and serene display of this market produce with the choreographed sections to techno music, and me sort of shouting like market trader-esque, kind of like pushing Aniela on. And then every day we'd do a second performance in the afternoon that was the performance in reverse, and we'd be deinstalling and dismantling the market that we'd set up, and by that point the flowers would have rotted and degraded further. And then, we'll move on.
And the next three projects all took place in Glasgow, where I live, and that's the only London project that we're going to talk about now. This one was called The Second Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, and it was for Glasgow International 2016. This is the ruin of a church that was designed by Alexander Greek Thompson, who, if you've been to Glasgow, is probably, alongside Mackintosh, the kind of main celebrated architect or city planner. And this church is in the Gorbals area of Glasgow, which, again, if you know Glasgow, the Gorbals is quite notorious in the sense that in the post-war period, all of the housing was completely razed to the ground, and people were moved to huge developments in the outsides of the cities, which have then also since been demolished and left people kind of scattered beyond Glasgow. So the reason that this church is abandoned is that it's at the intersection of two major main thoroughfares for traffic in the Gorbals area, and it just kind of is lying in that state and probably will continue to for a while. But it was chosen by the artists Neil Bromwich and Zoe Walker as a site for a temporary project for Glasgow International in 2016, and they proposed that the space be reanimated as a circus, a temporary circus, for the duration of the festival. So on the first site visit, myself and Isabel, Olivia Norris and Isabel Pamplona are the two other performers in Stasis. We kind of went to see the church, and it was freezing, and we thought we'll just wear really skimpy dresses. And this is a mistake we've continuously made throughout our practice, I think, doing work in Glasgow and being really inadequately dressed for the weather. But we thought it looked nice and kind of served the purpose of what we wanted to show. But we were thinking of the kind of wider history of the church, and maybe the idea of queering marriage is one of the notes that I wrote in my book at the time. Thinking also about the history of amateur and professional theatre in the area, because there's a big theatre called the Citizens Theatre that's just down the road. It's actually being redeveloped at the moment. And the history of karaoke in Glasgow, because there's a really strong, I guess, passion for karaoke in Glasgow. And thinking about tying these things into a kind of circus brief. So originally thinking about wedding cakes and eating cakes, but that turned into sitting on cakes in the end, and also face planting cakes. So we had this sort of quite flamboyant performance during which, it was really short, I think it was only 5 minutes, during which we would dance and face plant these cakes and sit on the cakes, and would just get this increasingly sort of I guess sullied by the cakes as we went along. We were also thinking about the sort of history of protest in Glasgow, and also the suffragette movement, so that's why we had the sashes, and I guess there is a strong history of social protest in Glasgow, particularly within the Gorbals area, but also more generally speaking, and I'll talk about that a little bit more with one of the other projects. So that's just to give an idea of this one here. This is the next one that you're going to talk about.
So then for the next GI in 2018, we were approached by a curatorial group called Love Unlimited, and they were doing a project at Easter House Pool, also in Glasgow, obviously. I suppose we get asked to do quite a lot of projects that, in the same way with the church, respond to a particular space, but are very limited funding-wise. So we can't, there's not enough funding for us all to come together to develop a new piece. So we often have to adapt existing choreography from previous works or stuff that we're already working on to sort of fit with the space. But it's quite difficult balance because we want it to be sort of sensitive to the place that we're performing in, but also don't have the means to do something entirely new. So this piece was actually some choreography that we were already had been working on for another piece, and we adapted it to the swimming pool setting, so kind of creating more sort of water aerobic fitness class angles to the choreography that we already had, and we had a scene with I don't know whether we've got a photo, with a blow-up crocodile, and again I think singing is a reoccurring feature in our works, and Isabel was singing along to Taylor Swift on the umpire, not umpire, lifeguard chair. And yeah, it was actually in that way of having to adapt existing work to this setting, it actually fed back into the work it was originally meant for, and that's really nice in the way that through going through these different permutations of different spaces, it develops the work in sort of unexpected ways. And so obviously it would be nice to be paid to make new work for each project, but in some ways it can like throw up unexpected benefits too. Yeah, that's the fight with the crocodile.
And then the final project that we're going to talk about is, I guess, the only self-initiated one, both drawing from and presented in a public space, that we're going to talk about today. And the choreography that we used at the second one, the one that we just showed you in the swimming pool, was actually intended for this final project, but the commission for the swimming pool took place in a timeline before that one, so we kind of used it to try out the ideas that we'd later use here. This work is called The Sedate, and it came about through an open call between the Workroom, which is an artist-run studio space in Tramway, and Merchant City Festival, who were collaborating together, and they did a call out for new work from Merchant City Festival. And Merchant City, again, if you know Glasgow, is quite a, it has a very sinister history in terms of it being intrinsically linked with kind of the capitalist-driven colonial empirical kind of I guess, drive of the empire at the time. And there's actually some interesting work that's been made in that space responding directly to the history of colonialism through the work by Project X, which is composed of Glasgow artists Melly Brooms, Ashanti Harris and Rhea Lewis, and also Nima Sene, so really taking on that particular history. I think at the time for us, it was around the time where there was a lot of information coming out about public spaces that were actually private spaces, or public spaces that on the surface seemed public but were actually private. And I think it felt important to make a work that was talking about exposing the logic of capital or something. So we wanted to open up a private space. And so the private space that we chose was a huge building site that was in the middle of the city. And initially I viewed it from the top of the roof of a car park, like an NCP car park or something, and thought, oh, it would be great to do something there, but probably they won't let us because it's a building site, because there's so much health and safety issues inherent to working in a building site. But really weirdly, JCJ, who's the property development company that owned that building site, were incredibly lenient, and they didn't do any health and safety checks on us at all. And the only thing that they stipulated was that the audience was not allowed to be in the site, but as long as we were, and we'd signed a disclaimer that if anything happened to us or we stood on anything really sharp, that we wouldn't press charges against them. They weren't interested in stopping us from doing what we wanted to do. So that was actually really great, because that didn't seem to be, I think there was a lot of concern when we originally proposed the building site due to the kind of obvious issues that might be inherent there, and so it was really fortuitous that they let us do it. And the original idea had been that the public would be able to view the performance from the roof of the car park, where I'd initially seen it, because it gave you this incredible operatic kind of scale view of the city as a whole. And that, however, fell through because it was owned by NCP, and they were really not up for having people view things from the top of their car park. So in the end, we had to restage it with us in the building site and the audience on the outside of the building site. But I think it was really amazing because it was such a huge, huge empty space that is eventually going to be turned into luxury flats that's been lying dormant for 2 years and is still lying dormant because they haven't figured out how to, they've got planning permission, etc., but they're still not sure how they want to render the site as profitable as possible for themselves. So whilst they're deciding all of that, it's just this huge wasteland of such a dramatic scale. And I think the performance in that space became kind of, the idea of it became to make a document of a particular historical moment before it was developed. And I guess a lot of the work dealt with the kind of underside of neoliberalism, or the feelings of fear and destruction and kind of end of times apocalypticism that comes from working in that kind of environment. I think that it felt like we wanted to touch upon the precarity of the city, and also that the kind of the rubbish that you're in is what everything is built on and what everything is reduced to at the end of the day. I think there was also a kind of strong undercurrent of the kind of surveillance that takes place in public spaces. And when we were filming the work, so the work became a one-off live performance, but it also became a short film. One of the security people from NCP car park actually called the police on us because they thought that it looked like we were, we were only dancing in the rubble, but but they thought that it looked suspicious, so they called the police, and the police came. And I think when they saw us dressed in these outfits with wearing stiletto heels in the car park, they understood that nothing sinister was going on. But there was a kind of sense that you were being watched in this space at all times, even if you couldn't see people in the building surrounding it, people were watching you. And that felt kind of particularly potent, and also particularly intrinsically linked with the kind of ideas behind the sort of capitalist drive of the city, and of it being quite a scary place at times. And I think maybe there's maybe you want to talk a bit about the aesthetic concerns of the piece as well.
Yeah, I think I make most of the costumes for the performances, and the sort of prop elements, and I think we really wanted to reflect the sort of simultaneous, we saw something very operatic, and Aniela was saying, this feeling of being watched while you were on this site kind of felt almost like a sort of amphitheatre or something, like people would kind of come up to their windows in the buildings surrounding the site while we were there and be watching out, and sometimes like call out to us, and so it kind of felt even when there wasn't an audience there was, and so this feeling of being on show and very like high drama location, but that also we were on the rubble of what used to be a shopping centre, so it was literally like the fallen remains of like a emblem of consumerism, and so we were kind of reflecting that in the like sort of party dress outfits that that we were sort of dressed up for a night out, but then we had these huge bag for lives that we would sort of emerge from and be hidden within, and sort of drop the tracksuit trousers that we were wearing like we needed to take a piss on the site or something, and like just like the original, playing with this original facade of being sort of polished, high femme on a night out women, and that sort of all crumbling, like the site that we were on. So kind of, yeah, playing with the building up and collapsing of our image on the site.
Yeah, definitely. And I think maybe through all of this, the one thing that's felt important to take forward is I think a lot of people think there isn't that much of an audience for dance or performance art, or that that's somehow inherently more restricted than other art forms. But I think when you actually place things in the public realm, it immediately demonstrates that if you're doing something that's interesting or even just a bit weird, then people will kind of flock to it and they'll want to watch. They might not like it and they might think it's really shit or something, but like they're also there and engaged, and that maybe becomes a place where conversations can take place. And I think a big barrier for a lot of people to see work is the fact that a lot of it isn't free, and particularly with dance, I think it's easy for that to become an incredibly a luxury in many ways, and for it to become kind of a thing that takes place behind closed doors and in a kind of quite elitist fashion, I suppose. So yeah, probably leave it there. Yeah.